Hey, I'm Charlie. Welcome to Millstone Research. So I have a confession to make. As recently as a couple of years ago, I held two serious misapprehensions. One was that both sides of my family becoming Jehovah's Witnesses in the early 1970s was the primary cause of their unhealthy relationship dynamics, parenting, and coping strategies. The other was that the abuse and neglect I'd experienced wasn't all that bad and had not seriously affected me. When reflecting on my witness upbringing at that time, the most honest that I was capable of being with myself was that I probably could have been treated better, which is quite the understatement looking back now. I was still in therapy then, doing a lot of reading about trauma, and having a lot of very long and honest conversations with friends I've known since childhood who were also raised in the Watchtower's imaginary kingdom, and had also managed to escape. During one of those conversations, a friend said something that challenged my first misapprehension. They said, "Well, my mom's parents treated her even worse, and they were never witnesses." That didn't fit neatly with my assumptions, and it got me thinking about my family's history. Soon enough, I had created a spreadsheet version of my family tree with one important difference. I annotated and color-coded this genealogy to include things like poverty, parental loss or abandonment, domestic violence and sexual abuse, divorce, gambling and addiction, chronic illnesses, and so on. I noted which members of my family had become Jehovah's Witnesses and which had not. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had made what's known as a genogram, and when it was complete, my life experiences made so much more sense than before. When presented all at once, I can trace the generational descent of unhealthy family dynamics and compulsive behaviors as easily as height or hair color. The books I was reading provided vocabulary for my findings, concepts like enmeshment, trauma bonding, attachment theory, and the 4F trauma types: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, which are the innate survival strategies habitually relied upon by child abuse survivors. As we discuss these subjects, please note if any of these describe your behavior, the behavior of your family members, or the behavior of members of the so-called spiritual family that we were all adopted into. See, humans, and most creatures on Earth, respond in predictable ways in response to danger. Like imagine someone home late at night hears a window shatter. What will the person do? They'll freeze and listen closer. That's one survival strategy. A masked intruder enters the room carrying a weapon. The person attempts to take flight, to flee outside and escape to safety. That's a second survival strategy. The intruder blocks their path. The person attempts to fight, a third strategy, but it fails. At this point, if you were a rabbit in a field and freezing, fleeing, and fighting didn't work, you'd be a coyote's dinner. But humans have a fourth survival strategy: to fawn or appease. When fawning, a person's behavior becomes docile, submissive, and supportive, clearly communicating that they are not a threat to their attacker. Now imagine a child whose emotionally dysregulated parent unpredictably creates a threatening or neglectful home environment. The child cannot fight or flee their parent, at least not effectively. So the only options left are to freeze or to fawn. Freezing is a dissociative response. When an experience is sufficiently frightening or painful, the child's conscious awareness retreats into a fantasy or third-person perspective, which allows the child to imagine that whatever is happening over there, rather than the reality, which is that it's happening right here, to them. This is similar to what you see in nature shows when a zebra is lying in the jaws of a predator, perfectly still but alive. The zebra is not really there anymore, it's just waiting for it all to be over. And so is the child. A close friend of mine has vivid childhood memories of flying around her living room while her father, an elder, raged. That is dissociation. As Pete Walker writes in Chapter 6 of Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, many freeze types hide away in their rooms and reveries, fully convinced that the world of relating holds nothing for them. The freeze response, also known as the camouflage response, often triggers a survivor into hiding, isolating, and avoiding human contact. If you are a freeze type, you may seek refuge and comfort by dissociating in prolonged bouts of sleep, daydreaming, wishing, and right-brain activities like TV, online browsing, and video games. Numbed-out contentment then morphs into serious addiction. This in turn can lead to addictive self-medicating with substances like alcohol, marijuana, and narcotics. Alternatively, the freeze type can gravitate toward ever-escalating regimens of antidepressants and anxiolytics. I also suspect that some schizophrenics are extremely traumatized freeze types who disassociate so thoroughly that they cannot find their way back to reality. Flight, or fleeing, is the obsessive-compulsive response to threat. This often manifests as perfectionism, restlessness, anxiety, compulsive behavior, and addiction. Many flight types stay perpetually busy and industrious to avoid being triggered by deeper relating. Others also work obsessively to perfect themselves, hoping to someday become worthy enough of love. Such flight types have great difficulty showing anything but their perfect persona. They are obsessively and compulsively driven by the unconscious belief that perfection will make them safe and lovable. Flight types relentlessly flee the inner pain of their abandonment with the symbolic flight of constant busyness. Fawning, or appeasing, is the codependent response to threat. Many fawn types avoid emotional investment and potential disappointment by barely showing themselves. They hide behind their helpful personas and over-listen, over-elicit, and or overdo for the other. By over-focusing on their partners, they then do not have to risk the real self-exposure and the possibility of a deeper level of rejection. Fawn types seek safety by merging with the wishes, needs, and demands of others. They act as if they believe that the price of admission to any relationship is the forfeiture of all their needs and rights, preferences, and boundaries. A fawn type / codependent is usually the child of at least one narcissistic parent. The narcissist reverses the parent-child relationship. The child is parentified and takes care of the needs of the parent, who acts like a needy and sometimes traumatizing child. Pressing the child into codependent service usually involves scaring and shaming him out of developing a sense of self. Fight is a narcissistic response. It is proactively using intimidation, violence, or the threat of violence to ensure that no one ever opposes them. Many fight types avoid real intimacy by alienating others with their angry and controlling demands for unconditional love. This unrealistic demand to have their unmet childhood needs met destroys the possibility of intimacy. Moreover, some fight types delude themselves into believing that they are perfect. They see the other as the one who needs to be perfected. This defensive belief then entitles them to totally blame their partners for relationship problems. Fight types learn to respond to their feelings of abandonment with anger. Many use contempt, a poisonous blend of narcissistic rage and disgust, to intimidate and shame others into mirroring them. Narcissists treat others as extensions of themselves. The price of admission to a relationship with an extreme narcissist is self-annihilation. One of my clients quipped, "Narcissists don't have relationships, they take prisoners." This type typically relies on scapegoats for the dumping of his vitriol. These unfortunate scapegoats are typically weaker than him. They may be members of a disenfranchised group, the ethnic employees, the gays, women, his problem child or wife, etc. He generally spares his favorites from this behavior unless they get out of line. If the charming bully is charismatic enough, those close to him will often fail to register the unconscionable meanness of his scapegoating. The bully's favorites often slip into denial, relieved that they are not the targets. Being a scapegoated child or spouse of such a bully is especially problematic because it is so difficult to get anyone to validate that you were or are being abused by them. So that's all pretty interesting. Did you see anyone you recognize? Of course, everyone can display these behaviors at times, and they exist on a spectrum of severity and in hybrid forms. When used appropriately in response to stress or threat, knowing when and how to freeze, pause or contemplate, flee, disengage or escape, fawn, compromise or reconcile, and fight, assert and defend boundaries are essential tools for protecting ourselves in healthy ways. The issue is that, because these survival strategies are automatic responses to threat and fear, and because children in abusive and neglectful environments are afraid all the time, these survival strategies become ingrained habitual patterns of behavior that continue to be relied upon throughout a person's life. Trauma also leads to recreating these abusive and neglectful environments in our adult relationships, which is called repetition compulsion. In these families, there's always at least one emotionally dysregulated parent whose emotional state and stability, keeping them calm, not making them angry, not making them sad, becomes the responsibility of that person's partner and children. That language even speaks to this, because a healthy, emotionally regulated person cannot be made to feel sad or angry because they understand that their feelings are their own, and that they, not others, are responsible for how they choose to express their emotions. This creates a situation where the needs, wants, thoughts, and feelings of the more emotionally dysregulated parent are always treated as more important than the rest of the families. Whenever that parent loses control, the rest of the family suffers for it. This is how performing in prescribed habitual ways gets equated with safety and belonging in the mind of a child, and safety and belonging is a life or death issue at any age. An emotionally dysregulated parent may be a perfectly nice person most of the time, but during those other times they are a very real and costly threat. You probably already know who that was, or is, in your life. In families with a raging, emotionally dysregulated parent, the fawning, codependent co-parent has two options. They can become an enforcer, amplifying the abusive parent's behavior by explicitly supporting or even participating in the abuse, or an excuser, which teaches their children that this treatment is acceptable or even deserved. Regardless of which role the co-parent adopts, the outcome is the same. The children learn that abusive behavior must be tolerated, and that it is the victim's fault when their best efforts fail to regulate their abuser's emotions, which will always happen eventually. See, parental abandonment doesn't only happen when dad goes out for a pack of smokes one day and never returns. A child experiences abandonment every time they are in a hostile and frightening situation and adults are present who do nothing to prevent it. If you've ever known someone who habitually relies on the fight response, then you know that these people aren't necessarily exploding or attacking all the time. They don't need to, because the mere possibility of it happening is enough to ensure that everyone around them stays out of their way and defers to them without resistance. The same is true for the covertly narcissistic or depressive parents who, not disappointing, soon becomes the family's highest priority. Fear, obligation, and guilt are the tools of the trade in both cases. Growing up in these homes is a constantly hostile and frightening situation, because there is no way to anticipate what will destabilize the emotionally dysregulated parent next. As a result, everyone has to remain on guard or hypervigilant at all times. You can actually sense this when you visit the home of an abusive family. It was certainly present in mine, and in all of my Jehovah's Witness friends' homes too. It feels like a strange tension in the air, a collective holding of breath, a cautiousness in how everyone talks and acts. What that is perpetual fear, and what it leads to is another generation of children who display symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The CPTSD diagnosis was first proposed by psychologist Judith Herman in her 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery. I'd like to share the first diagnostic criteria for the condition. A history of subjection to totalitarian control over a prolonged period, months to years. Examples include hostages, prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, and survivors of some religious cults. Examples also include those subjected to totalitarian systems in sexual and domestic life, including survivors of domestic battering, childhood physical or sexual abuse, and organized sexual exploitation. So, question for you. How bad is being raised as a witness really? I'd say if raising children a certain way consistently leads to symptoms of complex trauma as adults, they're a bit worse than I probably could have been treated better. These families inevitably develop a culture of silence. Since no one knows what will cause the next meltdown, the range of acceptable topics and behaviors grows more and more limited over time, until no one can ever be honest about the experience that they're having, their needs or wants. Another common feature is appearances mattering more than reality. It's more important that everyone pretends to be a happy, healthy family, role-playing the narcissistic shared fantasy, regardless of what's happening behind closed doors. These two attributes create a perfect environment for sexual abuse and domestic violence to go unchecked in Jehovah's Witness families and congregations. In the interest of your time and their privacy, I'm not going to share every detail of my family's trauma genealogy going back to the 1930s, but I could. All four of my grandparents were born in the 1930s. All of them grew up in poverty, and none really had the safe, secure base, healthy and consistent structure, and healthy and consistent nourishment in the form of love, learning, attention, and time that are prerequisites for good enough parenting. My maternal grandfather's parents divorced when he was young. He sometimes stayed in boarding houses while his father worked. As far as I'm concerned, he was, and is, a decent man. Honest, always provided, never drank much, never beat or harassed his kids. He knew who he was and was engaged with reality. I always respected him, and I never feared him. My maternal grandmother was raised along with 5 siblings by an alcoholic, physically abusive father and fawning, codependent, excusing mother. My mother's parents met and married in 1956, and by 1963 they had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. It pains me to say this, but my maternal grandmother scared the hell out of her kids. She was a warm, funny, and genuine person who could also be invalidating, intimidating, and explosive when stressed. And when you're 25 years old, raising 5 young children, you're stressed a lot of the time. Based on everything I've learned over this past year, my grandmother exhibited all of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, which is one of the 4 cluster B personality disorders in the DSM-5. Notably, cluster B personality disorders are all born of childhood trauma. I believe that my grandmother's eldest son, my uncle, and eldest daughter, my mother, bore the brunt of her emotional dysregulation and invalidation. As a result, they became primarily responsible for keeping her stable, and this almost certainly led to trauma bonding and enmeshment. Enmeshment is a dysfunctional relationship pattern involving blurred or non-existent personal boundaries, unhealthy coping strategies, manipulation, and control, leading to a lack of independence and individuality. Trauma bonding is the unhealthy, dependent attachment caused by cycles of abuse that develops between a victim and abuser. This can happen between children and their abusive parents, as well as adults and their abusive partners, people who the victims are dependent on for comfort, support, and safety. I believe this may have been the case with my maternal grandmother, because after she became one of Jehovah's Witnesses, all 5 of her teenage children studied with the Witnesses, but my uncle and my mother were the only 2 to get baptized, my mother at 12 years old in 1973, and my uncle a bit later at age 20. I believe that this was an unconscious effort on their part to remain close to their mom, keep her stable, and earn her love and approval. In other words, becoming Jehovah's Witnesses allowed my uncle and mother to continue doing what they had already been doing for their entire lives as children, codependently putting their mother's needs above their own. As for my dad's side of the family, my paternal grandfather was the second of 4 children, and his father abandoned their family shortly after the 4th child was born. My father's father was a kind man. I never heard him speak ill of anyone, never saw him raise his voice, never saw him drunk. He also displayed the fawning codependent traits of toxic passivity, an inability to ever say no, an inability to stand up for himself or to stand out at all. He liked baseball and westerns, but I can't tell you anything about his dreams or passions because, to my knowledge, he never expressed them. My paternal grandmother was born in rural Puerto Rico in 1934. She was the oldest of 3 girls, and one day when she was 3 years old, their father came home from work complaining of a headache, laid down for a nap before dinner, and never got up again. My grandmother is a lovely and loving person, but she always exuded a profound mistrust and disappointment in life. I didn't truly understand what it was until recently, but I always sensed it there. For both of my paternal grandparents, their earliest memories of their fathers was the absence of one. Both grew up satisfying the emotional needs of their remaining parents and siblings. Neither child was sufficiently protected or provided for. Neither child was ever really seen. I don't know a lot about their lives as children or adolescents, but I knew them as adults, and I knew their siblings as well as their children, one of whom allegedly helped to raise me. They loved their children, but didn't really understand how to love them in a healthy way. As a result, they mercilessly spoiled and coddled my father and his siblings, as though telling their children no or allowing them to take risks and experience failure meant that they'd failed as parents. This approach severely handicapped their children, clipping their wings and keeping them emotionally and physically dependent on them as a way to keep them close. My father was born in 1958. Being the oldest, he probably got the worst of it, to such an extent that any connection in his mind between actions and consequences was, as far as I can tell, completely severed. Often, extreme spoiling, coddling, and indulgence doesn't look the way most people think of abuse, but the thoughts, feelings, needs, and wants of spoiled kids aren't seen in those families either. Instead, those children are treated as props and mannequins whose job it is to validate their parents' unrealistic self-image and expectations. By 1971, my father was 13 years old and had a 7-year-old sister and newborn brother. My father's 2 younger siblings likewise relied on several habitual survival strategies as adults, all of the same self-destructiveness, substance abuse, and relationship chaos that one would expect from being afraid all the time. It's important to point out that I just covered about 40 years of my family trauma genealogy before mentioning Jehovah's Witnesses or the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. If you choose to explore your own family history in this depth, I strongly suspect that you'll discover a similar pattern. This is because, and I hate to break this to you, happy and healthy families do not become Jehovah's Witnesses, but ours did. And investigating my family's intergenerational trauma provides strong explanations for why that happened. In 1968, my maternal great-grandmother developed cancer. She did not tell anyone that she had it, most likely seeing it as a grim exit route from her abusive marriage. My maternal grandmother was 31 years old and providing hospice care for her mother when 2 Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on her door. My maternal grandmother dismissed them at the time, though after her mother passed away, she contacted local Kingdom Hall for a study. Around that time, my great-uncle, her brother-in-law, was a Vietnam prisoner of war, and she was actively working to try to bring him home, but that never happened. She had also recently had another child, her 4th son. So my traumatized grandmother, having lost faith in human government, worried about the futures of her 6 children, and desperately missing her recently deceased mother, studies with Jehovah's Witnesses, takes the bait, and gets hooked. I say hooked in the same sense as a drug addict, because the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society is, among other things, an ideological drug dealer of certitude and purpose. My grandmother's decision to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses created friction within her marriage. My grandfather liked Christmas and their friends at church and did not believe that the world was about to end. So my grandfather, arguably the healthier of the 2 parents, wanted nothing to do with Jehovah's Witnesses and had to start hiding Christmas presents for his kids in a friend's garage. All while the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was printing things like this. The world has very little time left. Any future this world offers is no future. Wisely then, let God's word influence you in selecting a course that will result in your protection and blessing. Make pioneer service, the full-time ministry, with the possibility of Bethel or missionary service your goal. This is a life that offers an everlasting future. And this, if you are a young person, you also need to face the fact that you will never grow old in this present system of things. Why not? Because all the evidence and fulfillment of Bible prophecy indicates that this corrupt system is due to end in a few years. Of the generation that observed the beginning of the last days in 1914, Jesus foretold, "This generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur." Therefore, as a young person, you will never fulfill any career that this system offers. If you are in high school and thinking about a college education, it means at least 4, perhaps even 6 or 8 more years to graduate into a specialized career. But where will this system of things be by that time? It will be well on its way toward its finish, if not actually gone. And this. Reports are heard of brothers selling their homes and property and planning to finish out the rest of their days in this old system in the pioneer service. Certainly this is a fine way to spend a short time remaining before the wicked world's end. As you can see, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was printing lies in the late 60s and early 70s that were identical in nature to the lies they are telling Jehovah's Witnesses today. And my grandmother, my uncle, and my mother believed them. Not because they made any sense, but because they exploited my grandmother's pre-existing emotional vulnerability and ignorance of the Watchtower's methods and history. Just like her mother, my mom's mom also died of cancer in 1990 at 52 years old. This event emotionally chained my mother and uncle to the Watchtower, because exactly as my grandmother had been told in the 1970s, her two witness kids were now forced to stick around if they wanted to see her again very, very soon. They've both been waiting for the last 30 years. This is how the Watchtower takes dead loved ones as hostages, and it still happens every single day. I'm reasonably sure that the Watchtower first appeared on my father's side of the family through my grandmother's younger sister, her husband, and his family. When my great aunt and her husband fell prey to the Watchtower's nonsense, it was only a matter of time before she was bullying the rest of the family into validating her delusions and converting as well. In order to maintain ties with his cousins, my father was the first member of his immediate family to get baptized, in 1976, followed by my grandmother in 1977, and my grandfather in 1978. If you ever fall in love with a narcissist, there are a few distinct stages that your relationship will go through. First is the idealization phase, during which time you'll be love-bombed and begin living in a narcissistic shared fantasy which causes you to believe that you can finally have everything you want in a relationship, so long as you do and become whatever the narcissist decides you must do and become, which is someone who exists solely to satisfy their demands. Idealization is also taking place on the part of the codependent partner, who focuses on their partner's positive qualities while minimizing or ignoring abusive behavior and other red flags. Once mental, emotional, physical, and often financial dependence has been established, things will move into the devaluation phase. During the devaluation phase, it will gradually become harder and harder to earn the safety, love, affection, and belonging you so desperately want, an unwinnable game of do more, do better, and you will do this while blaming yourself, sometimes for years or decades, in the hope of getting back to how things were at the beginning. That's not possible, though, because the savior/villain image of you that the narcissist has been having a relationship with only exists in their mind, while the image of the narcissist that you originally fell for never existed at all. If you ever stop being useful to them, or if you ever let the narcissist know that you're done with their game, that you see through their lies, and that how you're being treated isn't right, you will enter the discard phase, during which time you are likely to be threatened, gaslit, slandered, scapegoated, and ostracized, as though your refusal to tolerate their abuse makes you the greatest traitor who has ever lived. And finally, months or years later, the narcissist will return for the hoovering stage, during which they will attempt to pull you back into their lies and their lives, or failing that, simply emotionally destabilize you and ruin your day. If you ever become one of Jehovah's Witnesses or fall in love with a similar group, you will cover the exact same stages. The idealization phase of discovering the truth and being accepted as one of God's people, followed by a gradual devaluation phase and discovery that there is no amount of effort that will ever be enough. Then the discard phase of shunning, disfellowshipping, and scapegoating. And finally, the hoovering phase of random guilt trip texts or calls by JW friends and family to encourage you to return and serve some more. A relationship that relies on emotional blackmail, enmeshment, and trauma bonding is an abusive relationship. A relationship that can only ever end in devaluation and discard is an abusive relationship. If you don't want your kids to end up in an abusive relationship someday, then don't raise them in one. Victims of childhood trauma can be exceptionally receptive to narcissistic shared fantasies and relationships that recreate past abusive environments. And the Watchtower's worldview offers exactly that. Which brings us back to the 4 Fs. Grandiose, contemptuous exceptionalism and victim-hero status for the narcissistic fight types. Constant perfectionism and never enough do more, do better messaging for the obsessive-compulsive flight types. Potent biblical, apocalyptic, and salvation and paradise fantasies for the dissociative flight types. And long-suffering servitude and exploitation for the codependent fawn types. Being one of Jehovah's Witnesses has something for everyone with a history of trauma. The Watchtower Bible and Tract Society bears plenty of responsibility for the coercively destructive influence on our families, no doubt. But if your family was anything like mine, then they were already a family in crisis when they became Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, that's primarily why they became Jehovah's Witnesses. Children who are victims of abuse, neglect, illness, war, poverty, natural disasters, crime, and other crises understandably come to see the world as a dangerous, unjust, and frightening place. This leads to a disinterest in and hostility toward reality and life itself. Further crises that have always happened and likely will always happen serve to strengthen that negative bias, and the Watchtower exploits that by claiming that those events are evidence for their apocalyptic worldview. Take a look at the fear-mongering found in, every Watchtower publication or the JW newsroom page for examples of this. So when some neatly dressed, seemingly happy and healthy strangers with very well-behaved children showed up with some magazines and told our traumatized parents and grandparents that yes, you're right, the world is dangerous and unjust and frightening, and in fact, all of those things were foretold in the Bible, and soon this wicked world and all the bad people who hurt you will be destroyed. Well, That message really resonated. Victims of trauma frequently experience intense states of guilt, shame, fear, and uncertainty. Even when things out here are perfectly calm, an inner Armageddon continues to be waged inside their and our hearts, minds, and bodies. So when our parents and grandparents were told that the world was about to end, they believed it, because it already felt that way to them all the time, and it was a relief to finally have a reason for it. My ancestors were not monsters or villains. They were frightened, traumatized, emotionally dysregulated children in adult bodies, trying and largely failing to avoid traumatizing their own children. This template of emotionally dysregulated narcissistic abuser, fawn and codependent excuser, and terrified parentified children appears in numerous forms and severity in the parenting and adult relationships of my parents, my stepfather, my grandparents, and in me. So I find myself wishing that someone, at any point, had gently pulled any of us aside and said, "Here's the deal. You're hurt. You're scared. You're angry. This is where that all comes from, and this is how you can heal from it." That never happened, so here we are. Even governing body members were innocent children once upon a time. Given everything we've discussed, can you imagine the severity of abuse and neglect required to end up as an authoritarian cult leader? Would you ever want to switch places with those intellectual and emotional toddlers whose fragile identities require them to build and maintain institutional levels of self-aggrandizing delusion? Because they were all raised in the same exact environments as we were. Having said that, authority and responsibility are inseparable, and the Watchtower's leadership are all grown men perpetuating very real harm. Just because you feel bad for a starving wolf doesn't mean that you should feed that wolf your children. It is undeniable that childhood trauma results from being raised in abusive communities and religions, but it works the other way too. Experiencing childhood trauma often results in families and individuals joining abusive communities and religions. Even so, my siblings, myself, and our cousins generally experienced less abuse, neglect, and deprivation than our parents did, and their parents did, and their parents did. I believe that's one of the reasons that the number of Jehovah's Witnesses in my family has dropped to less than half of what it was in the 90s, and after my generation is gone, my family will be almost completely free of the Watchtower's influence. If ignorance and abuse got us in, then education and healing will get us out. We may not have experienced good enough parenting, but this isn't black and white, all or nothing. Families and individuals are more complicated and interesting than that. The time, love, learning, concern, generosity, joy, and laughter that I've shared with my family were all real, and it mattered too. I love my family. I would not have invested the time and energy required to understand it if I did not. Our parents, and their parents, and their parents could not teach their children a family history that they were ashamed of or didn't understand. They could not provide the safe, secure base, love, nourishment, and healthy structure that was not provided to them, and they could not protect us from abusive parents, spouses, communities, and beliefs that they could not protect themselves from, first as children and later as adults. When a parent refuses to deal with their trauma, their children inevitably will. So that's how we all got into this mess, as families and individuals. In the next video, I'll be attempting to answer the question, what is the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, really? So that should be fun. Thanks for watching, and remember, you're not crazy, you're not alone, there are ways out, and it's going to be okay.